The alien war zone was a place that terrified even the bravest soldiers. It was a landscape of shattered buildings, broken streets, and a constant echo of distant explosions. The night air was thick with smoke, and the ground trembled under the sound of warfare. Everyone who entered this zone was either a survivor, a deserter, or a fool. But on this particular night, something unusual was happening. Amid the chaos, there was a lone figure, a human. A Deathworlder, they called him. He was lying peacefully on a torn, makeshift cot, right in the heart of this terrifying war zone. While alien forces fought fiercely around him, the human slept. The world around him was on fire, but he remained undisturbed, breathing calmly, unaware, or rather, unaffected by the chaos. For hours, artillery shells landed nearby, shaking the ground with deafening roars. Explosions rocked the buildings, sending debris flying. But the human did not stir. His name was Caden, a soldier from Earth, one of the toughest warriors the galaxy had ever known. He had seen it all. Beasts that could tear a man in half, natural disasters that could wipe out entire cities, and wars that lasted for years. But nothing, not even this alien war zone, seemed to faze him. Caden's background was anything but normal. Earth, his home planet, was a death world, a place where survival was a constant struggle. The creatures there were fierce and deadly, and the environment itself was unforgiving. Caden had grown up in this harsh reality, and it had shaped him into the soldier he was today. In Earth's unforgiving wilderness, a man learned quickly that fear was a luxury that didn't last long. Caden had learned this lesson early, and it had kept him alive through countless battles. Now, lying in the middle of an alien war zone, Caden seemed completely at ease. To anyone else, it was madness. The alien forces had been fighting for weeks, relentlessly bombarding this part of the planet with weapons and explosives. The battle for control of this city had drawn in every major faction in the galaxy. It was a nightmare for the alien soldiers who had come here, and many of them had been driven mad by the constant fighting and the fear of death that hung in the air. But not Caden. He was different. The soldiers from every alien race that had been fighting here were puzzled. Every one of them had been warned about the Deathworlder. The stories of humans from Earth had spread across the galaxy like wildfire. The galaxy knew that humans were different. They were survivors, fighters, and in many cases, they were unstoppable. But the aliens had never faced a human in such a dangerous place before. No one had ever seen someone so calm in a war zone that had broken entire battalions. The alien commanders had sent their best scouts to observe Caden, expecting to find a vulnerable target. Instead, they found nothing. Every time they approached, they were met with silence. They'd seen humans fight, but this was something they hadn't expected. They had expected Caden to be hiding, to be holed up in a building or waiting for an opportunity to strike. But no, Caden was lying there, in plain view, completely unaffected by the surrounding terror. It was both unsettling and confusing. The alien soldiers had never encountered anything like this before. In fact, it seemed as though Caden was completely immune to the horrors of the war zone. How was it possible that a human could sleep in the middle of such an awful situation? The night stretched on. The battle intensified. The alien soldiers watched from the shadows, wondering what Caden's next move would be. But Caden didn't move. He didn't flinch when an explosion sent a nearby building collapsing to the ground. He didn't even blink when a group of alien soldiers raced past him, firing their weapons wildly. For some, this silence was even more terrifying than the violence of war itself. But Caden knew better. He had been through worse. Earth was a planet that bred survivors. Only the strongest lived to see another day. And Caden had learned to sleep through anything. He didn't just sleep out of fatigue. He slept because he could. This war zone, with all its dangers, was nothing compared to the death and destruction he had faced back home. The alien soldiers had no idea what it was like to live on a planet where the very environment could kill you. Caden had survived that. He had survived far worse than this alien conflict. In the early hours of the morning, a new threat appeared on the horizon. A group of alien fighters flew overhead, their engines roaring as they approached the area. Caden's eyes remained closed, but his body was already in motion. His senses were finely tuned to the environment around him. He could feel the vibrations in the air, hear the distant rumble of the ships, and smell the faint scent of fuel as the alien fighters drew closer. But Caden didn't panic. He had learned to anticipate danger without letting it overwhelm him. He knew when to act and when to wait. The alien pilots were in a hurry, focused on their mission, unaware that they were about to fly into a trap. Caden's mind was sharp as a blade, and in the brief moment before the alien fighters reached him, he adjusted his position. With a smooth, practiced motion, he reached for his weapon. It was a specialized gun, one built to survive the harshest conditions. The weapon was quiet, deadly, and designed for precise, calculated shots. Caden had spent years perfecting his technique, and he was ready for whatever these aliens threw at him. But he didn't fire right away. Instead, he waited. He listened. He watched. The alien fighters swooped low, coming in for a strike, and that's when Caden made his move. In one fluid motion, he aimed and fired. The shot rang out in the stillness of the war zone, hitting one of the fighters dead on. The ship exploded in a fiery burst, sending debris scattering across the ground. The other fighters veered off course, startled by the sudden attack. Caden was already moving again, disappearing into the shadows before they could even get a second shot off. The aliens were now more cautious. They knew something was off. They knew the human was still alive, still out there. But what they didn't understand was that Caden wasn't just a soldier, he was a predator. And he had just given them a warning. As the alien forces regrouped, Caden lay back down on his cot, his breathing steady. The war zone around him was still a nightmare, but for him, it was just another night. He had learned long ago that fear didn't help in situations like this. The key to survival was control, and Caden had it. He closed his eyes again, as the sounds of war continued to fill the air. The night was far from over, but Caden was no longer worried. For him, the real danger was not in the explosions or the alien attacks. It was in the patience, the strategy, and the calm that kept him alive. In the heart of the war zone, the Deathworlder was at peace. The war zone was a labyrinth of debris and twisted metal, a place where even the bravest soldiers feared to tread. For the alien forces, it was a constant struggle, a nightmare they could never wake from. The explosions, the gunfire, the screams, they were all part of the terrifying reality they had been thrown into. But Caden, the human soldier, was different. To him, it was just another night. Caden awoke the next morning as the first rays of light pierced the thick smoke in the air. His body had never been as rested as it was now, despite the chaos that surrounded him. He stretched, his muscles moving fluidly, his senses on high alert. To anyone watching, it would have seemed almost unnatural. This human, lying in the heart of the alien battlefield, completely unaffected by the madness of war. For the aliens, it was incomprehensible. How could a human sleep through an assault that had broken even the most hardened of their soldiers? How could anyone remain calm with death so close at hand? It wasn't possible. Or at least, that's what they thought. Caden knew something they didn't. He knew that this war zone, despite its horrors, didn't come close to the dangers he faced on Earth. Their survival meant learning to live with constant threats, from deadly wildlife to merciless storms. Here, in the alien world, the risks were different, but not nearly as terrifying. As he packed up his gear, Caden felt the vibrations of heavy footsteps approaching. He didn't need to turn around to know what was coming. The ground shook slightly with the movements of alien war machines, their enormous frames clanking as they advanced. These creatures were larger, stronger, and better armed than most of the soldiers Caden had faced. But none of that mattered to him. He adjusted his rifle, making sure it was loaded and ready for action. The weapon felt like an extension of his arm, its weight familiar, comforting. The aliens might have had advanced technology, but Caden was the true weapon. His training, his instincts, and his experience all came together to make him a lethal force in any environment. The first alien machine appeared from behind a collapsed building. It was a massive war tank, its armor thick and nearly impervious to most weapons. Its alien crew scanned the area, searching for any signs of human life. They knew about the Deathworlder, of course. Everyone did. The stories had spread like wildfire. A human who could survive in a war zone, untouched, unbothered, was a legend in the making. But the tank's crew didn't know that Caden had already spotted them. He had seen their approach long before they even knew he was there. His eyes were sharp, his senses heightened. He was like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The tank rumbled closer, its guns aimed straight ahead. Caden could hear the whir of its targeting system as it locked onto potential threats. The aliens inside had no idea that they were being watched, tracked, and hunted. Caden took a deep breath. His body was still, his mind focused. He had one shot at this. There was no room for error. The tank would be upon him soon, and if he missed, there would be no second chance. The moment the tank entered his range, Caden sprang into action. He moved swiftly, silently, his body fluid like water as he took cover behind a ruined structure. His rifle was already aimed at the tank's weak spot, the small gap between its thick armor plates where the crew was most vulnerable. In a single motion, Caden pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, sharp and precise. The bullet hit its mark, piercing the gap in the tank's armor and striking the crew inside. The explosion that followed was massive, sending debris and flames shooting into the air. The alien machine was destroyed in an instant, its crew reduced to nothing but a pile of scorched metal and flesh. Caden didn't celebrate. He didn't even flinch. He just watched as the remnants of the war machine crumpled to the ground. His heart rate remained steady, his breathing calm. For Caden, this was just another part of the job. But for the aliens, it was a shock. They had underestimated him. They had assumed that their advanced technology would be enough to crush the human soldiers. After all, they had seen what Earth was capable of. The human race was known for being resourceful, relentless, and capable of surviving impossible odds. But they didn't understand just how deadly a human could be in the right circumstances. As the smoke cleared, Caden moved on. He was no longer worried about the tank. It was just a small obstacle, one that had been easily removed. There were bigger threats on the horizon, but Caden didn't mind. He had faced worse. The aliens had no idea what they were up against. They were playing a dangerous game, one that they couldn't win. With every step Caden took, the war zone seemed to shift. It was as if he was altering the very nature of the place, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. He was no longer just a soldier in an alien conflict. He was something more. He was a force of nature. And the aliens were about to learn that the hard way. The night was still young, and there was plenty of chaos yet to come. But Caden didn't worry about that. He knew that as long as he was alive, the war zone belonged to him. The alien forces might have been strong, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. As he disappeared into the shadows, another explosion rocked the area, followed by the distant sound of alien ships flying overhead. Caden didn't look back. He didn't need to. The war zone was his domain now, and no one, alien or otherwise, was going to take it from him. As the days went by, the alien forces began to realize something they had never expected. The human soldier they had underestimated was not a mere anomaly. He was a harbinger of destruction, a force unlike anything they had ever encountered before. They had launched their attacks with the expectation of overwhelming and crushing humanity. But now they faced something far more dangerous, an opponent who seemed to thrive in the chaos. Caden's movements were deliberate, methodical. He seemed to be everywhere at once, striking from the shadows, dismantling the alien forces piece by piece. The aliens tried to regroup, to form defenses, but Caden was always one step ahead. His experience on Earth, facing threats no other species could survive, gave him an edge that the aliens could not match. But it wasn't just Kaiden's skills that set him apart. It was his mindset. While the aliens were focused on victory, Kaiden's mind was always on survival. Every move he made was calculated, not out of a need for glory, but out of necessity. He knew that the war zone was a place of constant danger, and only the most resourceful could survive. Kaiden wasn't just fighting for victory. He was fighting for his life. In the heart of the war zone, Kaiden's actions began to have a ripple effect. The alien forces, who had once been confident in their superiority, were now on the defensive. The whispers of his deeds spread throughout the enemy ranks. Soldiers who had once believed in their unstoppable might were now questioning their mission. They began to fear the human soldier who slept through their worst attacks, the soldier who tore apart their war machines with ease. And as the fear spread, so did the chaos. Kaiden had a plan. He knew that he couldn't take on the entire alien force alone, not in the long run. But he didn't need to. The war zone was his playground, and every step he took was designed to wear the aliens down. He wasn't just killing them. He was driving them into disarray. He was forcing them to waste resources, to divide their forces, and most importantly, to doubt their own ability to win. He knew that the longer he stayed in the war zone, the more the aliens would lose their grip on control. They would start to make mistakes, slip-ups that would give him the opening he needed. And when that moment came, he would strike, swift, silent, and unstoppable. The aliens, however, were not unaware of the toll the war had taken on them. They were well aware that Kaiden's presence was wreaking havoc on their forces. They were beginning to organize a response, but it was a response born out of desperation. The more they hunted him, the more they lost. They began to throw everything they had at him, hoping that sheer numbers and firepower would finally overwhelm the human soldier. But Kaiden was always a step ahead. Kaiden had become a ghost in the war zone, a shadow that haunted the aliens' every move. They would advance, only to find that he was no longer there. He would strike from behind, disabling their communication systems, cutting off their reinforcements, and leaving them isolated and confused. With every strike, he chipped away at their resolve, until they no longer seemed like the powerful invaders they once were. In one of his many raids, Kaiden stumbled upon a massive alien supply depot hidden beneath the rubble of a destroyed city. It was a goldmine of weapons, ammunition, and resources that the alien forces had been relying on to keep their war machine running. The moment Kaiden discovered it, he knew that this was the turning point. If he could destroy this supply line, he would cripple the aliens' ability to wage war and force them to retreat. But getting to the depot would not be easy. The aliens had set up a tight perimeter, with armed guards patrolling the area and automated defense systems in place. It was a heavily fortified location, and Kaiden knew he would have to approach it with caution. But he also knew that the risk was worth it. This was his chance to deal a crippling blow to the alien invaders. As he moved into position, Kaiden felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. He was no stranger to danger, but this mission was different. It wasn't just about survival now. It was about changing the tide of the war. The alien forces had been too confident, too certain of their victory. It was time to show them that humanity was not to be underestimated. Kaiden's movements were precise, calculated. He disabled the perimeter's security systems with ease, slipping through the cracks in the alien defenses like a ghost. As he approached the depot, he could hear the faint hum of energy shields and the clatter of alien soldiers inside. But he didn't falter. He had been in worse situations before, and he was ready for this one. With one final check of his gear, Kaiden set his sights on the depot's central power core, the heart of the entire operation. He knew that one well-placed shot would be enough to set off a chain reaction, destroying the supply depot and everything within it. He took a deep breath and steadied his rifle. The shot was clean, precise, and devastating. The explosion that followed was deafening. The alien supply depot erupted in a fiery blast, sending shockwaves through the war zone. Caden watched from a distance, his expression unchanged as the alien forces scrambled to respond. In that moment, Caden knew the war had shifted. The aliens had been relying on this depot to maintain their invasion, and now it was gone. They had no idea how much damage he had just caused, but they would find out soon enough. The balance of power was no longer in their favor, and Caden, the human soldier, had just sealed their fate. The battle was far from over, but Caden was beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel. The alien forces had underestimated him, and now they would pay the price. The explosion that tore through the alien supply depot echoed across the war zone. It was a seismic event, the shockwave reverberating through the very foundations of the alien army. Caden didn't wait around to watch the full destruction unfold. He knew that with every passing minute, the alien forces would regroup, and they would be angrier, more determined than ever to find and eliminate the human soldier who had become their nightmare. Caden kept his cool, retreating into the shadows. He was no stranger to the dangers of war zones, and he had lived through far worse. The explosion had done its job. It had thrown the aliens into disarray. Now, Caden needed to take advantage of their confusion, to keep the pressure on them, and make sure they never regained their footing. As the days passed, Caden continued his guerrilla tactics, hitting the aliens where it hurt the most. He moved quickly, never staying in one place too long. The aliens were relentless in their pursuit of him, but each time they thought they had him cornered, Caden would slip away like a shadow. The human soldier was a ghost to them, a constant, maddening presence that tore through their ranks and left them questioning everything they thought they knew about warfare. But the fear in the alien camp was growing. They had been trained for battle, for conquest, but they had never faced an opponent like Caden. This wasn't just a soldier. This was a force of nature. He had destroyed their supply lines, crippled their communication networks, and disrupted their plans in ways they had never anticipated. The more they chased him, the more they realized that they were losing control. Caden was playing a dangerous game, one that relied on his ability to stay ahead of the alien forces. He was not simply running from them. He was setting traps, baiting them into making mistakes, and then exploiting those mistakes. His next move would be the most daring of all. He knew that if he could cripple their command center, the alien forces would be in complete chaos. The war would be over. But getting to the command center would not be easy. It was heavily guarded, surrounded by layers of defense, and swarming with alien soldiers. The aliens had learned from their previous mistakes and were now on high alert. Caden's every move would be scrutinized, and he couldn't afford a single slip-up. For days, Caden studied the enemy's movements. He observed their patrol patterns, their weaknesses, and their vulnerabilities. He learned their behavior, their rhythms, until he understood their every move. And then, when the time was right, he struck. Caden infiltrated the alien stronghold under the cover of darkness, moving with the quiet precision of a predator. His senses were heightened, every step calculated. He knew that the success of this mission would determine the outcome of the entire conflict. If he could destroy their command center, the war would swing in humanity's favor. He reached the command center's outer perimeter without being detected. The alien forces had set up a tight security network, but Caden was not deterred. He slipped past the guards with ease, using his knowledge of their weaknesses to avoid detection. He had been in tight spots before, but nothing quite like this. The fate of millions hung in the balance. As Caden approached the command center, he could feel the tension in the air. The alien soldiers inside had no idea what was coming. They were focused on maintaining their control over the war zone, unaware that the human soldier they had underestimated was about to bring their plans crashing down. Caden paused for a moment, taking in the sight of the command center. It was a massive structure, built to withstand anything the aliens could throw at it. But Caden had a plan. He knew exactly where to hit. He placed a series of explosive charges around the core of the command center, making sure they were positioned perfectly. The timing had to be flawless. If even one charge was out of place, the entire mission could fail. Caden double-checked his work, ensuring everything was set to go. With a deep breath, he set the timer. The countdown began. Caden didn't waste any time. He slipped out of the command center and back into the shadows, moving quickly and silently. The aliens were still oblivious to what was about to happen. They were too focused on the war to notice that the end of their empire was just moments away. As the timer ticked down, Caden knew there was no turning back. The explosion would be catastrophic. It would send a message to the alien forces that humanity was not to be taken lightly. They had attacked Earth, and now they would pay the price. And then the moment came. The command center exploded in a brilliant flash of light, followed by a deafening roar. The shockwave was felt for miles, rattling the alien structures that had been built to withstand anything. The explosion tore through the heart of the alien forces, sending shockwaves of panic and confusion through their ranks. Their command structure was destroyed in an instant, and with it, their ability to coordinate the invasion. Caden watched from a distance as the command center crumbled into rubble. The aliens had no idea how to respond. Without their leadership, they were lost. The war was over, and the humans had won. Caden's work wasn't done, of course. There were still remnants of the alien forces scattered across the war zone, but now, with their command center destroyed, they were nothing more than a disorganized mob. They would fall quickly, unable to mount any meaningful resistance. Caden knew that the battle had been won, but the war was far from over. There would be more challenges ahead, more battles to fight. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He had brought the fight to the aliens, and he had shown them what humanity was capable of. As the smoke from the explosion cleared, Caden knew one thing for certain. The aliens would never underestimate humanity again. The blast from the alien command center was more than just a victory. It sent shockwaves far beyond the war zone, reaching the ears of leaders across the galaxy. In the heart of enemy territory, Caden's success was already beginning to reshape the course of the war. The destruction of the command center had left the alien forces reeling. They had lost their most important strategic hub, a blow that would cripple their entire operation. But the ramifications were even greater. Alien commanders, once confident in their superiority, began to question the competence of their military leaders. The tide of fear began to shift, not just within the ranks of the invaders, but across the galaxy itself. News of the human soldier who had single-handedly crippled the alien invasion began to spread like wildfire. Whispers turned into stories, and those stories quickly morphed into legends. In the halls of distant alien governments, the name Caden began to take on an almost mythical status. It wasn't just a human soldier who had pulled off a seemingly impossible task. It was a symbol of defiance. A beacon that humanity was not only surviving in the face of overwhelming odds but thriving. But while the alien forces were left to scramble in disarray, Caden didn't let the success go to his head. He knew that the war wasn't over. There were still pockets of alien resistance scattered across the region, and they were not going to give up easily. If anything, the destruction of their command center would only make them more desperate, more dangerous. For Caden, there was no rest. The war zone was still a perilous place, and though his victory was a major blow to the alien forces, there was more work to be done. He needed to make sure the remaining alien soldiers would never be able to regroup and rebuild their power. He had to keep them on the defensive, disrupt their supply lines, and make it clear that any attempt to retaliate would be met with more devastation. Caden moved through the war zone with a single-minded focus. He had already proven his ability to take down high-value targets, but now it was about hitting them where it hurt most, cutting off their access to resources. Alien reinforcements had been pouring into the region for months, and the destruction of their command center had only slowed them down temporarily. But Caden knew that if he could sabotage their supply lines and prevent their reinforcements from reaching the front lines, the alien forces would be doomed. He had already observed the alien logistics operations from afar. He knew their schedules, the routes they took, and the vulnerabilities in their defense. Using his intimate knowledge of the terrain, Caden set traps. Simple but effective tactics that would cause maximum disruption with minimal exposure. He wasn't looking for a direct confrontation. He was playing a far more dangerous game, one where the goal was to weaken the enemy gradually, to wear them down and keep them off balance. As Caden sabotaged their fuel depots, communication relays, and transportation hubs, the alien forces grew more and more disoriented. Each strike was a blow to their coordination, their morale, and their ability to launch effective counterattacks. Caden wasn't just fighting a war. He was making a statement that humanity, despite its humble beginnings, was now a force to be reckoned with. But even as Caden's efforts brought the aliens to the brink of collapse, he faced new challenges. The alien commanders, desperate to stop the relentless attacks, had begun to regroup. They were forming new alliances with other alien species, ones that had once been neutral, but who now saw the destruction of their forces as a threat to their own existence. The alien war machine was adapting, becoming more coordinated, more formidable. Caden knew that he couldn't keep up his lone wolf tactics forever. He needed to bring the fight to the aliens in a way that would rally humanity to his side. He wasn't the only one on this battlefield. There were millions of others who had also suffered under the alien occupation. It was time for him to take the fight global, to unite the scattered human resistance forces, and show the aliens that humanity would never back down. Caden sent out covert messages to the scattered human outposts, rallying them to join his campaign. His fame had already spread, but now it was time to turn that legend into action. The human race had been pushed to the brink, but they were ready to fight back. Within days, the resistance groups had begun to gather, and Caden found himself leading a growing army. His tactics were still effective, but now they had the strength of a full-fledged military force behind them. Humanity was no longer just defending itself, it was becoming the aggressor. The aliens were beginning to realize that the tide was turning. The sheer force of Caden's attacks, combined with the strength of humanity's united resistance, was no longer something they could ignore. They had underestimated humanity before, and now they were paying the price. But the war was far from over. The aliens would fight to the bitter end, and they still had overwhelming numbers. Caden knew that if humanity was to survive, they would have to keep pushing forward, to keep taking the fight to the heart of the alien empire. And while Caden's tactics had shaken the enemy to its core, he knew that the final victory would require more than just clever strategy. It would require the combined willpower of every human soldier, every man and woman willing to stand and fight for their future. As the resistance grew stronger, Caden felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle had just begun, but with each victory, humanity's chances of survival grew brighter. The alien forces had underestimated them before, and now they were facing an enemy they could no longer ignore. Caden wasn't just fighting to win a war. He was fighting to secure the future of his people, and no matter what it took, he would make sure the aliens learned the hard way that humanity would never be enslaved. The ripple effect of his actions had begun, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The situation had changed drastically. Once a divided force, humanity was now a unified power, rising from the ashes of past defeats and pushing back against an alien force that had once seemed unbeatable. Caden's relentless attacks on the alien supply lines and infrastructure had crippled their ability to wage war effectively, but the aliens were not ready to give up. As Caden moved deeper into enemy territory, he began to see the full extent of the alien empire's desperation. The command centers that once operated with brutal efficiency were now shambles, and alien officers who once held great authority were now constantly shifting their strategies, looking for a way to fight back. But no matter what they tried, they were always one step behind Caden. In the midst of this chaos, Caden received unexpected news. A large fleet of alien warships, more advanced than any he had encountered, was heading towards the war zone. It was a response to the damage he had caused. The aliens knew that if they didn't crush him soon, their entire war effort would collapse. Caden had anticipated something like this. He knew that the alien empire, while disoriented, would eventually regroup and try to make a final stand. This fleet, massive and heavily armed, was their last hope to turn the tide of the war in their favor. The aliens were betting everything on this one decisive strike. They were no longer interested in subtlety. They would come at him with everything they had. Kaidan's response was simple, but it was going to be the most dangerous move of his entire campaign. He knew that if he could destroy this fleet, the aliens would have no chance of recovering. Their last great military force would be gone in a single crushing blow. But if he failed, everything would be lost. The clock was ticking. He had only a small window of time to prepare before the fleet arrived, and the enemy was closing in fast. Kaidan's usual guerrilla tactics wouldn't work against a force this large. He needed something bigger, something that would take them by surprise. He began rallying his resistance forces in secret, gathering soldiers from across the galaxy to launch a massive assault on the incoming fleet. They had no choice but to strike hard and fast. Every moment counted. There was no time for hesitation. But Kaidan knew that a frontal assault would never work. He had to find a way to destroy the alien fleet before it could even reach his position. He had a plan, one that was risky and dangerous, but if it succeeded, it would be the turning point in the entire war. The key to his plan was the planet's ancient defense system. It had long been dormant, forgotten by the galaxy, but it was still there, buried beneath the surface. Kaidan had discovered its existence while studying alien maps and schematics. This weapon was older than the alien empire itself, capable of causing devastation on a scale that few could comprehend. The weapon had been designed as a last resort, a planet killer that could be activated to ensure the survival of humanity. Kaidan wasn't about to use it for total destruction. Instead, he planned to use it in a way that would take the alien fleet completely by surprise. They would think they were heading into a typical battle, but they would be walking into a trap far beyond anything they could anticipate. The weapon, though ancient, had a very specific function. It was capable of generating an energy pulse powerful enough to disable the alien fleet's shields and disrupt their communication systems. If Kaidan could use it in the right way, he could make the fleet completely vulnerable. The only problem was that the weapon required a direct connection to the planet's core, a place that was heavily guarded by the alien forces. Kaidan knew it would be dangerous, but there was no other choice. His resistance group was already spread thin, and he didn't have the luxury of waiting for reinforcements. He had to act now. As Kaidan and his team of elite fighters infiltrated the enemy's defenses, the tension was palpable. Every step forward was one closer to either victory or certain death. The closer they got to the weapon's activation point, the stronger the alien resistance grew. The aliens had been forced to concentrate their forces around the area, making it a dangerous and heavily guarded region. It wasn't just the enemy soldiers that Kaidan had to worry about. The planet's harsh environment, ravaged by war and toxic terrain, made every step a battle in itself. But Kaidan was determined. His mind was focused on the mission ahead. Nothing else mattered. After days of stealth and brutal combat, Kaidan and his team finally reached the weapon's control center, hidden deep within an underground fortress. The last alien forces were dug in, determined to prevent the activation of the weapon at all costs. Kaidan knew that if he failed now, humanity's only hope would be gone. In a tense standoff, the final battle erupted. Explosions rocked the facility as both sides fought desperately. The resistance was outnumbered, but they had one advantage: their sheer determination and their trust in Kaidan's plan. The battle was fierce, and casualties mounted on both sides, but Kaidan pressed forward, his mind focused on the end goal. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Kaidan reached the weapon's core and activated it. The power surged through the facility as the pulse generator hummed to life. The pulse would soon be sent into space, targeting the incoming alien fleet. As the pulse shot through the atmosphere, the alien warships began to falter. Their shields flickered, their communication systems went down, and chaos erupted within the fleet. The once mighty armada that had come to crush humanity was now vulnerable, and Caden knew that this was the moment they had been waiting for. But the war was far from over. The alien forces would never stop coming. But this single act had turned the tide, and humanity now had the upper hand. With the alien fleet in disarray, Caden's resistance group could strike back with full force. The ripple effect of this moment would be felt across the galaxy. The aliens had made their fatal mistake. They had underestimated humanity. Now they would learn the price of that mistake. The pulse had done its job. The alien fleet, once a formidable force, was now in chaos. Caden's gamble had paid off, but it was far from over. The alien forces, though disoriented, were not defeated. They still had overwhelming numbers, and their warships were still a massive threat. But for the first time in this long war, the aliens were on the back foot. Humanity had the upper hand, and Caden knew it was time to press the advantage. As the chaos unfolded across the alien fleet, Caden called for the full mobilization of his forces. The resistance, which had been quietly building strength for years, now had the opportunity to strike with everything they had. The alien forces, disorganized and confused, were no match for the newly emboldened humans who had the element of surprise on their side. Caden and his team led the charge, pushing through the alien defenses with relentless precision. They had the advantage of knowing the terrain, and the aliens, though technologically superior, were struggling to coordinate a response. The once feared invaders were now scrambling, reacting to humanity's every move. The battles were intense, and Caden could feel the weight of each decision pressing on him. With every push forward, there were casualties, but the momentum was on their side. The war had reached a turning point, and humanity was not going to stop until the aliens were driven from their home. The alien fleet, still recovering from the pulse, was now vulnerable to targeted strikes, and Caden's forces exploited that weakness. The final battle was approaching. Caden's team made their way to the heart of the enemy's command center, where the last remnants of the alien leadership were holed up. The once unshakable empire that had thought it could crush humanity was now in its final moments. The last alien leaders, realizing the tide had turned, made their last desperate attempt to escape, but they had underestimated Caden and his team. As they closed in on the command center, the alien leaders prepared for a final showdown. Their warships, though damaged, were still formidable, but Caden was determined to end this war once and for all. He knew that the battle would be hard, but humanity could not afford to show mercy. The alien empire had invaded their space, wiped out their colonies, and killed countless innocents. It was time to make them pay for what they had done. The final battle was brutal. Explosions ripped through the command center as both sides fought tooth and nail. But humanity's resolve was unbreakable. Caden and his team, though exhausted, pushed forward. They fought with everything they had, and slowly but surely, the alien leadership was defeated. As the last alien commander fell, the war finally came to an end. The once mighty alien empire, which had thought it could conquer humanity, was shattered. The remnants of their fleet retreated, and their forces, now scattered and leaderless, could no longer pose a threat to humanity. Caden stood amidst the wreckage, breathing heavily, but with a sense of victory. They had won. The human colonies, once on the brink of destruction, were now free. The alien invaders had been driven out, and humanity had proven that they were not to be underestimated. The aftermath of the war was not without its costs. There were still countless scars left behind, and rebuilding would take time. But humanity had emerged victorious. Caden's gamble had worked, and the alien empire had learned a harsh lesson. Never underestimate the strength of humanity. As Caden looked out over the battlefield, he knew that the war was over, but the work was far from finished. Humanity had proven its strength, but now it had to rebuild and ensure that such a war would never happen again. The galaxy was vast, and there were still many unknowns. But for now, Caden could finally allow himself a moment of peace. The dragons had been awakened, and humanity had risen to face them. The story of humanity's victory would be told for generations to come, a testament to the resilience and strength of a species that had been pushed to the brink of annihilation, only to rise and fight back with everything they had. The war might have ended, but the legend of Caden and his team would live on forever.